Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first Fireside chat of the new year. And we have Saul Garcia with us today. We're going to talk a little bit about our go-to-market rollouts and some of the challenges that we might face and how to overcome them. I'm your host, Tyler Simons, and I am head of customer success here at Fullcast, and we're a go-to-market planning and execution platform for those of you that don't know. Before we kind of dive into today's topic, Saul, why don't you go ahead and give us a little rundown of what you're up to and a little background.
Sure. Thank you, Tyler. Saul Garcia, head of revenue operations at a company called Health Recovery Solutions. And we are a remote patient monitoring solution for hospitals, home health agencies, hospices, etc. I'll stick with that.
That's it. That's so short. I love it.
Yeah, I love short and sweet.
Let's get into the meat of this. I mean, I can't remember. Were you a January cutover or are you a February cutover? Like, have you cut over for next fiscal year yet? Like,
got it. January.
Plans?
Yeah, we're January.
Yeah, I don't know why I call it a cutover. I think that's just like an internal thing that we do because we like have like multiple plans in our software, and you would like cut over to another plan.
Makes sense.
Anyway, sorry. So have you gone through that yet?
Yeah. Okay. I call January our 13th month because regardless of what you do and how you try to cut over, there's always so much still that has to be done in the first month and / the end of the previous year. So it's sort of this theme that I call within our RevOps meetings that January is the 13th month of 2022.
So this is fresh for you.
Yes.
Let's talk about, we're kind of going through this whole go-to-market build out, right? We've done all this planning. This has typically come from last year, but one of the things that I have seen repeated for a lot of our customers is they've done a good job about building trust with not just sales leadership, but also the reps, right? So what are some of the things that we can do to build trust with our reps, and just help them with, is this plan fair or is this based on good data? What are some of the things that you've done there?
Yeah, I think having trust is important when rolling out a plan. I think there are certain ways that you can build that trust. I think you start with as much transparency as possible in the data, right? So you might say, hey, territory 1, your quota is this, territory 4, your quota is this, and so forth. And if you give no context into how you came up with that number, they're going to naturally be skeptical of that number, right? So I think as transparent as you can be in how you got to that number, I think within reason, obviously, but if you can kind of walk to that and you can sort of explain how you got to that, how not only just what the quota is for the territory, perhaps a total number for that the sales team is trying to hit. The more that you can explain that and explain the walk towards that number, I think the more that people will trust that it's not just some arbitrary number that you're providing to them, right? I think that's one way. I think another way is obviously you can't get everybody involved, but getting some people involved in the process early on and getting some for sort of the end user / consumer of the plan. Getting them involved in some way, and you have some champions that can also feel that they've been a part of the planning process, and when everything gets rolled out in their own personal Slack channel or Teams channel, they can say, hey, I was a part of this, and so forth. And so you have some champions, I think, involved in the process. And for me, it really is just about getting the buy-in, making sure that they feel like they're a part of the process, and then also just the transparency part.
What would be some scenarios that you would like be able to loop somebody in on that, like on the planning process? Like, is there like this account here, that account here, or what do you think about this data? Like, what are some things that we could be looking for to be like, hey, this is a great thing that I could bring in another stakeholder to build that trust?
I think one example is when we're looking at the segmentation and perhaps targeting accounts. Um, we can look at this empirically from a RevOps perspective, and we can look at the data and see what the data says. But I think it's always helpful to get some of the people on the front lines to provide some insight as well. You could say, hey, I'm looking at the data. This is what the data is telling me. This is what the story says. But what are you hearing? Or have things changed over the past 2 quarters? In our case, things actually have changed. So our market changed quite a bit actually in the first half of 2022 to the last half of 2022. Started to see competitors who were non-existent essentially early on. The sort of telehealth umbrella industry and market is changing fairly quickly. So it was really important to not rely on the entire 2022 data, but to start to look at how things are shifting perhaps towards the end, asking our sales team, is this what you're seeing as well? And just getting some of that buy-in too.
That would be super helpful. Do you spend any time with them, like talking about, what you've done with the data that you are presenting? Like, we went out and we purchased this data vendor because we felt like it's going to provide the most accurate annual revenue, employees, or
Yeah.
whatever it is that you care about. And do you walk through that process with some of these stakeholders at all to like kind of essentially just build that trust in the data that they don't think that you're just plugging this stuff in, making stuff up?
Yeah, I think that process is sort of embedded in our RevOps culture. We try to get 1 to 2 sort of internal champions for pretty much everything, whether it's building out a new object in Salesforce and whether that's evaluating a new vendor to bring in. And it's not always going to be the same individuals, right? If you're perhaps bringing in a piece of technology that's pretty complicated, you're going to get probably someone who is really great at adopting technology, and maybe on the other side of the spectrum, someone who maybe struggles a bit, just so that you can get both perspectives. But so it does depend, but for anything, absolutely. We're always asking our team for feedback on that. Does this data look valid? Again, this is what their database says, but based on what you're seeing, does that sound accurate? Does the size of this organization or this hospital sound accurate based on the conversations that you've had? So getting some validity in there as well.
Have you ever, I've seen some customers do this, is kind of why I'm just seeing, if you've kind of dealt with this as well, but exposing a lot of like how you think about balancing territories. So like this is, to the broader scope of the team, like I don't just balance territories, or we don't just balance territories on number of accounts. We're actually a little bit more sophisticated in that. And that's why you ended up with this territory and the quota that's assigned to this, right? So if I work all the way back, this is how we arrived at this number. And it's like number of accounts. And then we looked at also open opportunities. And then we've also got this really cool account score or potential. I mean, I don't know, like depends on how sophisticated and mature the organization is and how much data you got. But have you spent time doing that? And like, what's a great way to like get people involved? Like, because I would want to tell everybody that, but I don't know that that's possible. Is it still just like 1 or 2 people, like you were saying earlier?
Yeah. So when it comes down to sort of reviewing the territories as a whole for the entire team, we do go into quite a bit of detail on a full call with everybody, so that there's again some transparency there. And then also the managers will go in and they will kind of, using the data that we've provided, go through a breakdown of each individual territory. So just as an example, for the time being, our sales team is working a few different, or within each territory, there are a few different verticals that they might go after. So they might go after health systems and hospitals. They might go after home health agencies and other verticals, right? We'll have a breakdown of the total number of accounts within that territory. We'll also have a breakdown of what we believe the total opportunity is for the territory in 2023. Obviously, it's the total addressable market is not viable for many organizations within 1 year. We would love for that to be the case, but that's not the case. So
Yep.
we also determine what's the realistic penetration rate for that we can expect in
Yep.
2023. And on that, again, walking to that number, right?
Yep.
Now the segments might differ from territory to territory, and not every territory is created equal. To kind of your original point, there might be one that has a slightly higher or lower quota than others, but we make sure to balance that all out. And
Yep.
there's, I would say we're small enough to kind of take it one step deeper, where we can perhaps adjust territories based on sort of the experience of that rep, how long they've been in that territory and so forth, and what the opportunity is there. It does get a bit harder than that. The larger you grow, the larger the sales team is. You have to be a bit more objective, and I always try to not right size the quota based on who's in the quota, or sorry, who's in the territory. I try to look at the territory objectively and place a quota on that. I think that's the fair way to do that and to build a territory out. But when you're a smaller org, sometimes you do have some freedom to adjust.
I feel like that's another fireside chat for us, because
Yeah.
if there's one thing that like our tool does really well is when you get to that point of like assigning quota and you need to look at like the total potential of each territory, and you're dealing with quotas that may be different from things, that is kind of like the bread and butter, right? And
Yeah.
I'm like, this is where you should be if you're a fully mature RevOps organization in terms of building these territories out. And it's just a very it's a very hard switch too if you've just been kind of doing all these quotas kind of just flat, and here we
Right.
are. Anyway,
Absolutely.
that's a whole side point that we're not even here to talk about. So let's move, like, how do you start to figure out which roles are going to, I mean, there's obvious roles that are impacted, right? I think we could all say that like account executives or your sales reps are going to be impacted by rolling this go-to-market out. But there's also all these support roles and overlays and different people within the go-to-market organization that are also impacted. Is there anything that you do leading up to that to identify who's going to be impacted and then figure out how to communicate that?
Yeah. I think there's not a simple, in my opinion, at least in my experience, a simple solution to that all. Because what I find is it can be a bit of a cycle. You start to make progress in your planning phase. You know that this might affect your BDR team, your marketing team, this might affect other teams. And so you start to get these people involved in as early on as possible.
Mhm.
And then again, as the planning phases start to evolve and start to progress, there might be other things that change. And so then again, a bit of a cycle, you're bringing them in again to kind of keep everybody on board. But at the same time, it can't be a unilateral decision, right? It's not just RevOps' decision and or the CRO's decision or the CEO's decision. We have to continuously discuss this to make sure that everybody else is on board. If, for example, you don't include marketing, you say, hey, by the way, January 1, and it's December 25th or 24th or whatever it may be, and you're like, hey, this is our new go-to-market plan. You're not setting up your marketing team for success, right? So I think in my opinion, the only solution for that is like constant communication, making sure that everybody is involved in the process so that people know what's going on. Marketing might say, hey, I don't know if this segmentation makes sense for us as an organization, and maybe we need to rethink what we're doing. And I think the only way you cross that road is by communication.
Yeah, so you're looping in key teams early and often.
Yeah.
To make sure that they're involved in that process. Do you do anything as a part of like pushing out, we're gonna go live with our new go-to-market, we're gonna roll new territories and quote out, don't matter, January 6th. Is there anything that you like push out as a communication to the broader team about the schedule on stuff? Hey, we're going to roll this stuff out on January 6th. Salesforce is going to be down for 2 hours. I don't know. There's always a bunch of different factors for different companies, but curious in your experience what you've done with that.
Yeah, in my experience, I try not to, at least to the greater team, stick to a particular date, just because there can always be a delay or two in the process. But I do
Yeah.
try to stick to a particular time period. So in the first week or two of January, this is when we plan to go live, right? And I try to give myself a bit of a buffer, and then from there work our way back, right? And we're talking about this probably since the start of August, right?
Yep.
We start with August, we start with January and we work our way back. So what needs to get done and create different deadlines, and you probably have 25 different deadlines that you need to hit in order to walk all the way to January. But yeah, we work our way back from that, and that conversation does have to start really early. It's always interesting because you think, okay, we just got out of Q2, we're in the latter half of the year, and then you realize, wait, I have to start talking about 2023 or now 2024. So it's a never-ending cycle, but you have to have that conversation early on.
What if you like, you're talking about essentially some milestones that you need to hit. Like, what happens when you miss those milestones or a milestone and you really want to go live in the first 2 weeks of January? Do you just give up on that and say, well, it's going to be January 3rd? Do you end up like working a weekend? Like, how do you make up time that gets lost when you get behind schedule? I feel like these projects are so focused around like getting things done before SCO.
Yeah.
And SCO's usually set. And so you're kind of like racing and you got to make up for things that you're like waiting decisions on. Maybe you're waiting on marketing, maybe you're waiting on sales leadership to make a decision on segmentation. They're like 2 weeks late on that because they've got a bunch of stuff to figure out. Like, how do you deal with all of the things being thrown at you and you're like trying to keep the trains on time?
Well, I think we deal with it as much as possible, but it's not a perfect art. I think everybody in RevOps can relate to this. Here's how I generally approach that, though. I think when you're building your deadlines, obviously build a gap, build a buffer as much as possible. In the same way where you might build a 20% buffer when you're building out your quotas for your annual operating plan, right? Sort of take that same approach and build some buffers where needed. Keep those gaps and buffers to yourself. Don't tell everybody that they're sort of already built in. But I think it's also important to emphasize, because I think what ends up happening is, and I think every year that I've gone through this tends to be the case. Paralysis analysis happens more during annual planning than any other time of the year, right?
Yep.
So I think a lot of people will try to nitpick little things and say, well, these 500 accounts, we really want this to go in this segment instead of this segment, and so forth. And people start to nitpick everything, right? I think what I generally try to do is try to then set a precedent that if a decision isn't made, RevOps is going to make the decision. And usually don't have to resort to that. But I think when you do that early on, and then people realize, well, I do need to hit these deadlines. Because I think when you have a deadline that's 4 months out, it's really easy for people to think that it's okay to miss those deadlines, right? So I think the sooner you can set that precedent, the easier. And that way you can kind of just stay on schedule.
Yeah. My other thought when you were talking about that would be like, well, it's just going to be status quo.
Yeah, or that. Yeah, exactly.
If we could change the segment line, we don't have to, we could, but if we don't make this decision by this time frame, status quo.
Status quo, exactly.
I think it's super important because I see that happen so often on our end where, and I keep thinking about segmentation lines, but like, I mean, it could be anything, but like, even if it is the segmentation line, it's like, do we move up enterprise from 5,000 employees to 10,000 employees? And you're looking at all the data, all the reports. How does this change like the headcount plan for each of these things? And then I see that slip into like December, and you're like, well, that's a decision that should have been made really early on because you got a bunch of other planning that needs to happen from that, and it really affects all of those subsequent tasks. And so setting something like that up front and being like, well, RevOps says it's going to be 500. We're just going to go for it, whatever. Um,
Exactly.
what about, and this kind of goes, we talk about the like communicating just to our own internal teams, our the reps. Hey, this is what the territory, this is what your quota is going to be, this is the rollout plan. But a lot of times I think we get lost in all of this stuff that we're working on. We kind of forget about our customers, our prospects and customers, the people like the end users of this. Do you do anything to try to minimize disruption to the customers? And this might be a communication out, or it could be something that you're just keeping in mind. I'm just curious if you've got any things that you do during this process to minimize disruption.
I think I don't know if my opinion on this will be the most popular, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it.
This is the
So
point of it.
exactly. I first take the approach that I myself and most of us in revenue operations are customers. We work with multiple vendors, and so I try to look at those examples to see of those, which do I think have been sort of the most successful. Um, I think at some point you realize as a customer that there will be disruption at some point. You can't expect every CSM to be there through infinity. There's going to be changes within the organization. There'll be different segmentation from the customer side. I think to your point, I think the communication part is really what's key. Sometimes I'll see attempts of, hey, just going to set up a meeting, and or here's a really quick intro of who your new CSM is, and sometimes that works. But I think the clear and the more direct the communication is, and I think the quicker that change is, it just looks a little bit more professional. I've been on the experience where some are kind of slow. It's like, hey, this is your new CSM. I'm going to be on those calls on your calls for the next 2 or 3 months during the rollout process, etc. That kind of drags on a little too often. So based on the experiences that I've had, I think for me it's a bit easier and better to just sort of rip the band-aid off, but do so professionally, communicate it well, and to just kind of I think just be professionals about it. But the longer that it drags on, I think the more detrimental it can be. Sometimes having a new face is also extremely helpful. Now, sometimes they might be upset. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah.
That happens. Some people really like their CSMs, so they've had them for the last 2 years and they don't want to change. But the business does have to move on. And I think you have to take a step back and think, yes, this one customer might be upset, but we know the reason we're making this change is because it is better for the business. And we know that it's better for the business. So we have to trust in that and make that change regardless.
Is there anything RevOps can do to help with that?
I think
Maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know.
Like other than like the planning piece, right? Like when we're
Yeah, that's what I
planning,
was going to say.
everyone's always thinking about like, well, yes, accounts are going to need to shift around, but we're going to try and minimize we're not going to try and transfer the 50 customers from rep 1 to rep 2.
Correct.
We're probably
Yeah.
going to try and just do like the 5. But outside of that, I don't know like if RevOps can totally help with, oh, here's a template, or maybe that's the sales or the CS org and the
Right.
transitions.
I think what we can help is, this is sort of an indirect way, I guess, of helping. I think a lot of times organizations want the segmentation that they're using on the sales side to be the same way that is segmented on the customer side.
Mhm.
And that I think causes a lot of disruption. I think there are times where it can actually absolutely match and it can fit. But I think you have to sometimes realize that the way you segment on your customer side is likely going to be a little bit different. And when you can accept that reality, then I think you can have segmentation that's a little bit less disruptive, instead of, again, like you said, well, this CSM is tied to this sales executive and this sales executive is moving to this territory. So this CSM also needs to move to that territory because they work well together. But now, as you mentioned, all 30 customers might get transferred. That may not make that may not make sense, right? So I think it's understanding that segmentation can be a little bit different there. I think that's one way that we can sort of help. But to your point, I do think we can help operationally. Perhaps we can help build cadences. We can help build like different things, right? But I'm not sure that there's a really impactful, direct way that we can help with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got a couple minutes left. I just had this like, I want to talk a little bit about like post-rollout. Um, how do you deal with the influx of questions and problems? Like, do you set anything up? Like, how do you deal with like all the issues that come out of rolling out a go-to-market plan? Or maybe your go-to-market rollout is perfect and you don't need to worry about it. I don't know.
It's perfect. We can end here. No, I think you're always going to have some things that, as much as I think in RevOps, we try to be detail oriented and dot every I and cross every T. There's naturally going to be things that you might forget about. And sometimes a sales rep 5 minutes after a rollout plan, they say, "Hey, what about this?" And you're just like, "Wish I would have thought about that 2 months ago," right? I think a couple things. Having them participate early on in some of the planning process helps mitigate some of those changes. And again, a lot of those questions that they have a different perspective, so they're going to ask different questions, and you can hopefully resolve those issues earlier on. In addition to that, I think being really transparent in the rollout of the plan, again, is going to mitigate many of those questions, and just being transparent throughout the process is going to mitigate many questions down the road. I think what we do pretty well is we set up some office hours so that they can come in and sort of just ask these questions, and we'll run it for maybe 2-3 weeks. And that allows people to kind of come in and to ask those questions. If there's really important questions that were asked that we think would benefit everybody, we might summarize those and send that out to the team and say, "Hey, this great question was asked by so and so. Figured everybody should kind of hear this answer." And so I think those are ways that we can help mitigate that. But I think, you just have to also understand too and have a bit of empathy that this is a new plan. There might be differences and there might be some angst on the sales team around the rollout of a new plan, and just be really open to the fact that people might be curious and might have some questions. I think it's important for us in RevOps to really understand that as well. This is how sales makes makes their money and takes us home and supports their family and so forth. So, it's obviously going to be something that they want to understand as best as possible.
And you see people take advantage of these office hours, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. We utilize it much more often when we're, for example, implementing new processes and within our CPQ process, because that's always so complicated. Adding new objects in Salesforce, et cetera. So we use it a lot more on the technical side. And we do see quite a bit of success there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. I was just like, from kind of what I was thinking is like, oh, everybody in RevOps is gonna like, you kind of just pool all your resources. Everyone's done planning, and I know everyone wants to take a vacation, but we're gonna spend a couple of weeks just like answering tickets, pretty much, right? Like it's submitting tickets, and I need this transfer, this is wrong. There's probably like data questions that come up. Why is this employee value 500? I looked it up on this website and it says it's 750, so it should be mine or whatnot. And just taking all those resources to help triage everything that comes in. But the office hours is super cool because then you kind of control that time frame, and everybody can come in and answer questions and learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to direct people to that too, right? And someone asks you a question the morning of, say, "Hey, I'm working on something, have office hours later today. Can you show up there and I can help you with that question?" Get everybody in at the same time.
Super smart. And you don't have to like hit a dead stop in RevOps because you can just move on to the next project. We're out of time. I told you this was coming. So do you have any like silver bullets for us? Any kind of like overarching theme or summary? If there's like one takeaway for our group today, what would it be?
I think when it comes to rolling out a go-to-market plan and you're going through your annual planning phase, I think it's okay to plan for things to not work out as planned, right? I think when you understand that you might not hit certain deadlines, you might have things that are somewhat delayed or get pushed back. It's okay. I think on the other hand, especially in RevOps, we talk about data. We're obsessed with data. We want everything to be accurate. don't fall into the pit of paralysis analysis. I think
Hmm.
sometimes it's okay for us to say, hey, let's maybe take a step back and let's subjectively or qualitatively make a decision here, use data to inform our decision, but we don't need to completely rely on this either, right? Because I think when you do that, you start to split a lot of hairs, and sometimes you just kind of have to go with the, I guess, the consensus of the room. You have people with a ton of experience in the room to push things forward. I think those, in my opinion, those two things are the most important thing, or the most important things when it comes to planning for the next year.
Amazing. Saul, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Tyler. It's always a lot of fun.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining. And until next time, we'll see you later.